It's really good to see all of you and to be here. I feel like the sun is of a very different quality here in San Diego than it is in DC. I sort of feel like I'm on a different planet, so it's really lovely to get off that airplane today. I honestly never dreamed I would be on the same stage as Dr. Francis Collins, who I actually know more by a folk duet or two that we've had the good fortune of playing together in warm circles of friends and kind of rambunctious talent shows that David and I host back home. That's my main avenue of knowing, which is the only sort of, I don't know if that's more or less legitimate than any scientific pedigree that I do not have that would otherwise command his respect. My medical doctor of a sister once said to me, we were both in undergrad, I was a few years older. As Deborah said, I was at Wheaton College in Illinois, and I had become a philosophy major, and my younger sister was studying at Stanford University, pre-med, mathematics. She was in the throes of organic chemistry, and we were having like a catch-up sibling phone call, and she said to me, "Anne, you humanities majors are such fuzzies. How do you even get graded? There is no objectivity in your world." And I had to admit that she was right, at least at some immediate, obvious level. But I sort of retorted back that at least we fuzzies know how to have a good laugh about unanswerable questions of why and what for, and we may have fewer hang-ups about channeling that unknowing through less frontal lobe mysteries like music and friendship and dry wit just going further up and further in. So we all do what we can, and really thank you, Dr. Collins. I'll do my best not to embarrass the scientific advisor to the US president. I want to talk to you all today about something that I think is a bit counter to the scientific ethos, at least as I understand it. Not to be contrarian for its own sake, but rather to try to wrestle with you with the always confounding wisdom of Christian thought as it invites us to take view of our nature as humans than our world typically does. At once positioning ourselves to dignify that nature with supreme honor and love, and to be reminded always that at the end of the day, we are creatures. And that's something I want to talk to you about is limits. How understanding finitude, a concept as an emphasis, as a fundamental feature of our human existence, might counterintuitively be precisely the key we need in our era to recalibrate so much that has gone off the rails, so much that is dividing us. Might a more intentional focus on limits in the sciences, in medicine, in our personal habits, and our very own conception of self be a gift rather than an annoyance or a cause for depression? I don't know about you, but the world lately feels like it's a tiny bit on, or more than a tiny bit on fire. Ukraine is being destroyed, and there is threat of a larger war, even world-ending nuclear war. COVID still lurks in the background. Many of us are stressed by a social minefield of signaling faux pas when trying to dig into deep-seated pain points in our common life. Violent rhetoric is blowing from the fringe to the mainstream. Anxiety is at record highs. Racist acts are on the rebound. Friendships just continue to erode due to lack of attention and the long tail of social distancing. Huge effects of climate change are careening our way, and those actors that could help our world address it can't seem to unify sufficient political consensus. And just about everyone I know is confessing severe depletion in emotional and mental bandwidth. We just can't do or feel or serve any more than is already being put upon us. We are, whether a stay-at-home mother or a college president or a nurse or a pastor or a flight attendant or an abused restaurant waiter, we're all just a little bit spent and increasingly numb. And we are all these things, or we are spent and numb in part because there doesn't anymore seem to be much of a buffer between our day-to-day duties and the forces that are rumbling our world. The zeitgeist has snuck into our homes and our relationships, our work and our sleep. What was private is now often public, and what is public knows no peace. There was an article that went viral a number of months back that some of you may have seen. It was titled, "The 37-year-olds are afraid of the 23-year-olds who work for them." And it was about the different habits that Gen Z is bringing into the modern workplace. And it quite hit home for me because I lead a bit of a growing team at Comment Magazine with some younger spark plugs, and I am that very disoriented 37-year-old. A line that made me chuckle in the article with a little bit of uncomfortable recognition was the following. The reporter was interviewing the co-founder of a company, I think it was an organic food company, it's called Plant People. And the entrepreneur, sounded like a guy about my age, said this to the reporter. He said, quote, "I talk to older people in our organization and they're like, dude, we sell tomato sauce. We don't sell politics." Then you have younger people who work here coming in and being like, "These are political tomatoes. This is political tomato sauce." It's not just young people that are blurring the lines of what should be expressed where. College faculty increasingly understand their roles to be those of advocates of a particular cause rather than as seekers of understanding. Debates around critical theory have spilled into the public domain when the tools for using it productively are often known only by a very trained few. When people ask, "What church do you attend?" it seems these days more often loaded with political suspicion than spiritual care. This last month, and here I'm pretty torn. I actually don't totally know what I think about this. We're seeing not just governments sanction Russia, we've seen private companies and cultural platforms do so, all while kind of bobbing along to the ebbs and tides of public opinion. It seems clear that we are all chafing against a poverty of choice when it comes to those vehicles that can channel our noblest moral longings. Worshipping beings, and we all are worshiping beings, I think, whether we know God or we don't, invariably pivot if we are left hungry at the altar, especially in a culture just drenched in market competition. Today, the fact that those spheres that historically have helped organize, if not catalyze, a propulsive moral witness, you think about the church's role in the American Civil Rights Movement, government's role in expanding the vote to women and to people of color, journalism's role in exposing Watergate and other leadership and political scandals that would compromise our democratic process, science's role in discovering vaccines and medicines that can save lives and allow us to labor and commune together one more day. The fact that so many of these spheres are now perceived as suspect, irrelevant in some cases, impotent, or simply dismissed as belonging to a particular tribal group is as much an indictment on their institutional inability to navigate complex times with a clear sense of what they exist for, as much as an indictment of their forgetting of their, to use a fancy word like telos, their purpose. It's as much an indictment on them as I think as the ways in which we as human beings today are blurring the boundaries between what goes where. We have this mirror being shined on our own fecklessness. Because we too are shallow creatures. We get frustrated by the slow arc of justice, impatient for results, eager for scapegoats to explain away our pain. And so we choose the lowest hanging fruit, the platform that makes us feel righteous, the popular slogan, the quick condemnation. But we are often doing so as individuals, alone, facing these vast public issues and global trends. These grasps at isolated, fleeting bursts of meaning are leaving us dissatisfied and still more tired and confused as they yield deeper division and positional entrenchment. We seem to have discarded, whether by omission, or by choice, those bounded, small-scale opportunities to love and to serve, boundaried spheres through which to express and produce the goods for which that sphere was intended, and not to blur other purposes into it. Too many of us, maybe especially in this room perhaps, after a lot of us probably formed by covenantal relationships in our youth at an earlier time of sort of greater cultural coherence and just a backdrop frame of reference, at least in the US. Too many of us seem to have given up on the costly commitments that feed our souls and knit our sort of disparate selves into coherence, either because we feel we are too busy or they involve the messy work of fallen people loving one another and we just can't handle the friction that is part and parcel of healthy human relationships. For all of my generation's push to have our whole selves seen and nourished, I do run a podcast called The Whole Person Revolution, so I'm very pro whole people. A lot of us, though, I would say, seem to be reinforcing our sort of felt sense of disintegration internally with lives that are stretched between usually only two poles, but they're necessary demands, but they're two poles. One of which is work, and the other is the household. And then we seem to be pushing everything else out in between just to survive amid overwhelming schedules and still more overwhelming global forces. The neighborhood has become a scene of inconvenience. The casual encounter just too much to handle as I just want to get going with everything on my plate. Most people feel like there's no time to volunteer at the food bank or participate in the local town council. I need to make sure my boss doesn't need me while I scroll absent-mindedly by the playground swing, my kids begging for attention that I'm too weary to give. It feels safer and more efficient to post a social media message that declares where I stand on a given issue than to do the messy, often hidden work of repair. And in all of this, we seem to be forgetting about our creatureliness, our bodily caps and quotas, and the fact that we necessarily exist in space and time. We seem also to be ignoring our design for interdependence, for needing others, and being woven into a tapestry that allows this need to be expressed. We seem to be forgetting the invitation that's actually embedded in our finitude, or at least our late modern culture is forgetting it, pushing us as believers to be similarly deceived. And so we join what I would say are probably uniquely American currents to think that limits are de facto bad. Limits, not unlike suffering, are to be avoided, are to be overcome. It is our limits often, our feeling under-equipped, our inability to resolve something intractable that becomes the source of our anxiety and our fretting. Then our narcissistic tendencies maybe, and our created dread of just constant moral injury that we feel, instead of seeing these bump ups against our own limited capacities as the ingredient that God requires to create, to heal, to redeem, and to grow. When I was in college, back in the day, learning and laughing among the fuzzies, apparently, I had a political science professor by the name of Mark Amstutz, who was a formidable figure for those of us interested in questions of realpolitik and how this faith called Christianity interacted on the public scene in global affairs. He combined just a real respect for careful statecraft and tough moral realists, diplomats, and national heroes who had helped countries pass the genocide in Rwanda, the bombings in Ireland. He would bring in people who were at the time serving as peacemakers in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and what would become the Iraq War. So he was sort of on the world stage, he seemed to us when we were 19. But he was also pastoral, and he really sought to prepare us for a life in all of its inevitable sorrows and complexity. And I vividly remember one devotion at the start of a class when he looked at us with a kind of fierce love, and he said this: "If you haven't faced adversity, I feel sorry for you." And he said it again slowly, and he had this sort of had been a naval captain before he became a professor, so he still had that naval haircut, and it was just fierce. And he looked at us and he said, "If you haven't faced adversity, I feel sorry for you." Most of us, of course, at that point, age 18, 19, 20, we could point to moments of adversity, familial losses, fears, certainly broken romantic relationships. But given that it was a place like Wheaton College, and I think there are probably some people familiar with that school or sort of sibling colleges here, the bulk of us really came from stable households wrapped in love and a certain kind of attentiveness to presence with one another. A presence often to the most important things in life: God, people, service, rituals of worship, learning, laughter, work. So these words at the time really came as a kind of stirring inspiration, but also like a holy warning and a truth we would need before we understood it. Fast forward many years, and I've just really begun to see something profound in this professor's pity, in a way, as he put it. For in those times of loss in my own life, trauma, of being stripped bare and of being humbled by my own excesses, errors, and sins, it is precisely in those times when my croaking prayers seem to be exponentially received, when the cruciform nature of love itself is most vividly experienced. And I've just started to wonder, what would it look like to design more of our institutions and our public policies from something in this humble territory? What would it look like to structure our collaborations in the puzzle pieces of asking where our respective limits intersect, and not just where our respective superpowers might compete and complement one another? How could a conception of our individual limits reshape and beautify a richer whole in our friendships, in our marriages? How might the particular contours of your finitude puzzle piece in the particular contours of mine, and then maybe we discover a greater gold in our communion? How could our felt limits, in honest and particular naming of them, redesign our prayers? Not in a way that is self-punishing toward ourselves or incurious about others, but in a way that unlocks the heavens, really, for the liberation of God. The magazine of public theology that I have the great joy of leading, Comment Magazine, published a really poignant meditation in the first week of this war in Ukraine by a Croatian woman who'd endured the Bosnia-Serbia conflict years ago and who became a refugee with her family as a result. She now lives in Virginia, and I asked her to reflect now on what's happening in Ukraine. Is there something about wartime that could tell us something about peacetime? Her name is Irena Dragas Jensen, and I'm just going to read you a portion of what she wrote. Quote, "What is war? What is peace? I keep asking if they are mutually exclusive as I am thrust back into the dramatic commingling of humanity's paradox. Does one exist only when the other does not? Life is not neatly divided into separate segments. Life is a convoluted pattern of sorrow, joy, anger, conflict resolutions, tensions, kindness, fear, love, generosity, conceit, forgiveness, hatred, pain, healing, chaos, clarity, and God's presence. Always God's presence. All of this weaves an intricate pattern of life. This is true about life in times of peace. It is also true about life in a time of war. The difference is that in war, the components become extremely exaggerated and exposed. The colossal fear that envelops the mood of war can so overwhelm that we become paralyzed or ignite previously unimaginable actions. Anger explodes and cannot be contained. Pain transforms into uncontrollable hatred. Reason is overtaken by unchecked emotions. All these seem to morph into a giant, unstoppable fireball of evil. Right before the attack on our small town, many of our neighbors secretly left without warning us about the impending military action. These were the neighbors my sister and I played with daily. We went to the same school. My mom drank Turkish coffee with these friends most mornings. My dad shared his tools. We even went to church with some of them. But they did not warn us. It was the air raid sirens the next morning that did. As the war unraveled, brutal and vigilante-style killings were committed by both sides. One of our neighbors was killed by a group of his work colleagues who showed up at his door. A close friend of mine only recently shared with me how one day a group of soldiers came into the retirement home where she was working and beat every elderly person who belonged to a certain ethnic group. Previously unimaginable actions, now fueled by fear, anger, and hatred exaggerated and exposed. And yet joy, kindness, and generosity also get amplified. In a time of war, love transforms from an ethereal concept into incarnation and action, defending, protecting, sacrificing, giving. Strangers still, in wartime, love can become so embodied that it is indistinguishable from the pain and tears on suffering human faces. Virtue itself purifies to a crystalline shimmer, defying the ashes of destruction and loss. At the very beginning of the war in Croatia, my dad's quiet and steady ways of loving us steadily grew into incredible acts of bravery. He was at work in a neighboring town when the attack on our hometown happened. Despite the advice of the Croatian military, he entered our town and forged his way to our house. We all gathered, and it was decided that my dad would first drive our elderly neighbor to a hospital as she urgently needed kidney dialysis. Then the next day, he did it again. This time, he drove my mom, my sister, and me out of our occupied town to safety. During the 4 years of being refugees, and despite moving 6 times and enduring profound personal loss and hardship, my parents turned to serving others, unloading, sorting, and distributing thousands of pounds of humanitarian aid, counseling and hosting people, sharing their limited resources with others. In the midst of it all, they continued trusting God, even when tears flowed. One of my Croatian friends said it well in her text message while we were checking up on each other's emotional welfare as our own war traumas reemerged during the beginning of this war in Ukraine. She wrote to me, quote, "Life narrows drastically in these circumstances. Only basics matter now, really. Warmth, food, mere survival." I replied, "Yes, the great stripping has begun. The bare branches way of living. It's time to grow even deeper roots." War is a season of an intense stripping down. It is a time of revealing what it is that upholds us. This process of stripping is not unique to war. War intensifies it and makes it more visible. But being stripped bare is a part of life, even life in peace. That's just an excerpt. The German Lutheran theologian Hans Joachim Ivan once said, "Our faith begins at the point where atheists suppose it must be at an end. Our faith begins with the bleakness and power, which is the night of the cross, abandonment, temptation, and doubt about everything that exists. Our faith must be born when it is abandoned by all tangible reality. It must be born of nothingness and be given it to taste in a way that no philosophy of nihilism can imagine." These last few years, as we've all weathered COVID and sort of the social combustion it unleashed, I've just been trying to understand the mysterious connection between pain and thriving, between individual limits, very much my own included, and communal joy. What is the nature of this correlation? I've been wondering. What is the relationship between hitting rock bottom and the beginnings of the life that is really life? If I could answer that, might there be some clues as to how a whole society could emerge from this more whole and not more broken? I had spent some years prior to the pandemic studying moral transformation and the communities that change us for the better. And I consistently found that the most luminous examples would always land me back in the same scarred sandbox. It was the prisons, the addiction recovery groups, the communities ravaged by natural disaster, families forged in exile, all of which seem to hold the keys to life at its truest. You could try to copy the rituals and scale the principles, but without an experience of struggle or suffering, without the shared scars, the replicating sauce would be diluted, yielding fleeting shadows at best. There was just no getting around the fact that if you cared about positive growth, both for individuals and for society, somewhere along the way, there had to be a surrendering of rights, of pride, of denials and masks, and a willingness to be taken to the end of oneself. Only then were new beginnings rightly ordered. Only then was there hope of becoming whole. In another piece, Comment published actually just 2 days ago, we did an interview with this Archbishop Metropolitan for the Ukrainian Catholic Archieparchy of Philadelphia. His name is Boris Gudziak. He was reflecting on the spiritual dimensions of this war and what it tells us about the spiritual state of the West today. He said this about the sort of conviction that he senses the Ukrainian people as we watch them is sort of placing before us all. He said, "It is actually in crises like these that we are pushed to set aside our idiocy, especially in the etymological sense of the word, where we're just focused on our idios, our own selves, and we start opening up. The spiritual life is always a question of communion, a relationship. It's an openness to God. We Christians confess a God in 3 persons, that is communion and love in the Godhead. That's the giving of the Father to the Son and the Holy Spirit. That communion is what people are experiencing right now. They're helping each other. The isolation, the alienation drops because people need the communion to survive. And they find then that communion is really the truth. It's not just a coping mechanism." This is such a paradox. And you know I'm a fuzzy, so you may not take this that seriously from me, but I think that if our faith involves any kind of a mathematics, a science, I think this naming of nothingness, this focus and admission of all that is frail about this human life, that something there has to be part of the equation. For he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me." I wonder if something in Paul's words here is not just a spiritual exhortation, but a statement of natural law built into the fabric of our creation, a statement of our nature as creatures, not crucially the master creator, and that would have profound implications for our lives, both our individual way of being and our larger structural ways of doing. How do we live in light of death? What would it look like if our public policies were based on a resounding affirmation of this question and not a hapless, dysfunction-producing answer that seems too often to suggest that life is about nothing more than not dying? What would it look like to orient the instrumental hows and whats of science and scientific discovery around finitude as the central control in more of its experiments, less our boundless appetites for more and longer and less suffering and greater control, without any clear understanding of what such constant capacity expansion is for? What creativity could be unleashed and social brokenness healed if more of us, in more sectors, softened our assumption that to fulfill the human agency to which God has called us is to become some kind of Superman machine, and instead submitted ourselves to the disarming and really liberating appreciation for this other twin side of our natures, the Adam 2 side, the side that has been created and declared good, that receives and depends, and understand somewhere deep down that we just can't secure ourselves. Something about finitude, about our need to reweave a conception of limits into our approach towards this glorious life is sort of strangely inspiring my hope these days.